Have you ever found yourself explaining the same thing again and again, hoping that this time they'll finally understand you? You choose your words carefully. You soften your tone. You clarify your intentions. And still, somehow, you walk away feeling smaller, misunderstood, and exhausted. Here's a truth most people learn the hard way. Not everyone who listens is trying to understand you. Some people are only waiting for their turn to judge, dismiss, or twist your words. And when you keep explaining yourself to someone who has already decided who you are, you slowly begin to betray your own self-respect. There comes a moment in life when you realize something deeply uncomfortable but incredibly freeing. The problem was never that you didn't explain well enough. The problem was that they were never willing to understand. Think about that for a second. When someone genuinely cares, they lean in with curiosity. They ask questions. They listen between your words. But when someone refuses to understand, no amount of explanation will ever satisfy them. You could speak for hours, write paragraphs, pour your heart out, and it still wouldn't matter because the goal was never understanding. The goal was control, and the moment you recognize that, everything begins to change. Self-respect starts with a simple but powerful decision. You stop performing explanations for people who have already closed their hearts. You begin to realize that your energy is sacred. Your voice is sacred. And not everyone deserves unlimited access to either. Understanding this is the first step toward emotional freedom. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. There is a quiet trap that many kind, thoughtful people fall into, and it's called over-explaining. It usually begins with a good intention. You want to clear up a misunderstanding. You want the other person to see your heart, so you explain a little more, then a little more. And then before you realize it, you're defending your character in conversations that should have never become trials in the first place. And the painful part, you believe that if you just find the right words, the conflict will disappear. But here's the difficult truth. People who refuse to understand are not confused. They are committed to misunderstanding you. That realization can shake you. Because many of us were raised to believe that good communication solves everything. Speak clearly, be honest, stay calm, and people will meet you halfway. But life teaches a harsher lesson. Some people don't want clarity. They want control. They want you stuck in a cycle where you keep proving, defending, and justifying yourself. Because the more you explain, the more power they feel they have over your emotional state. And slowly, without noticing, you start questioning yourself. Maybe I didn't say it right. Maybe I sounded rude. Maybe I need to explain it better. This is how self-doubt begins to grow inside people who are actually doing their best. But self-respect asks a powerful question. Why am I trying so hard to be understood by someone who has never tried to understand me? The moment you ask yourself that question honestly, something shifts inside you. You begin to see that over-explaining isn't kindness. Sometimes it's a quiet form of abandoning yourself, and learning to stop is one of the most powerful emotional boundaries you will ever build. One of the most painful realizations in life is discovering that some people don't misunderstand you by accident, they do it on purpose. At first, this idea feels uncomfortable because we want to believe that people are simply confused, or maybe they didn't hear us properly, or maybe they just need more context. So we keep explaining, hoping clarity will fix everything, but sometimes clarity isn't the issue. Sometimes the issue is that understanding you would require the other person to take responsibility for their behavior. It would require them to admit they were wrong. It would require them to look at themselves honestly, and for some people, that is something they will avoid at all costs. So instead, they create a different narrative about you. They say you're too sensitive. They say you're overreacting. They say you misunderstood them. And suddenly the conversation is no longer about what happened. It becomes about defending your own reality. This is where emotional manipulation quietly enters the room. Because when someone keeps shifting the conversation away from the truth, they force you into a position where you feel the need to explain yourself over and over again. And the longer you stay in that loop, the more exhausted and confused you become. But here's the truth that changes everything. When someone truly wants to understand you, they look for clarity. When someone wants to control the story, they look for ways to dismiss you. The difference is subtle, but once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. And that's the moment self-respect begins to grow inside you. You start realizing that not every misunderstanding deserves your energy. Some people aren't confused. They're simply protecting their version of the story, even if it means refusing to hear yours. And once you recognize that pattern, something powerful happens. You stop chasing understanding from people who are determined not to give it. There is an emotional cost to constantly explaining yourself, and most people don't realize how heavy that cost becomes over time. At first, it feels small. You repeat yourself once or twice. You clarify what you meant. You try to smooth things over so no one feels uncomfortable. It seems harmless, even responsible. But slowly, something begins to happen inside you. You start monitoring every word you say. You rehearse conversations in your head before you speak. You analyze your tone, your facial expressions, your timing, all because you're trying to avoid being misunderstood again. And that is exhausting. Living this way slowly turns communication into emotional labor. Every interaction feels like a test where you must prove that you're kind enough, reasonable enough, patient enough. But here's the painful truth. When someone has already decided not to understand you, no amount of careful explaining will change their mind. Instead, the burden quietly shifts onto you. You carry the responsibility for fixing every misunderstanding. You feel the pressure to keep the peace. You become the one who must always stay calm, always clarify, always explain. And little by little, your voice begins to shrink. You stop saying what you truly feel because it feels safer to stay quiet than to enter another exhausting cycle of explaining. Your confidence starts to fade, not because you're wrong, but because you're tired. Tired of defending your intentions. Tired of repeating your truth. Tired of hoping that this time they'll listen. This is why learning to stop explaining yourself isn't cold or selfish. It's an act of emotional protection. Because self-respect means recognizing when a conversation is no longer about understanding and choosing not to sacrifice your peace just to keep it alive. There comes a quiet but powerful moment in life when you begin to understand something that changes the way you move through the world. Your worth does not need constant explanation. For a long time, many people believe the opposite. They believe they must prove their intentions, justify their boundaries, and explain every decision in order to be accepted. So they keep offering explanations like emotional currency, hoping it will finally buy them understanding. But real self-respect begins the moment you realize something profound. People who truly value you don't require endless explanations. They trust your character. They listen to your perspective. Even when they disagree, they still treat your voice with dignity. But people who refuse to understand will never feel satisfied, no matter how carefully you explain yourself. You could speak with perfect clarity, and they would still twist your words. You could show patience and kindness, and they would still question your intentions. Because the issue was never your explanation. The issue was that they had already decided who you are in their mind. And once you recognize this pattern, something inside you begins to shift. You stop chasing validation from people who are determined to misunderstand you. You stop bending yourself into emotional knots just to be seen as reasonable. And instead, you begin to stand quietly in your truth, not aggressively, not defensively, but firmly. You start to understand that dignity sometimes looks like silence. It looks like choosing not to engage in conversations where your reality will be constantly questioned. It looks like protecting your energy instead of spending it on endless clarification. Because self-respect is not about convincing everyone to understand you. It's about trusting that the right people won't need so much convincing. One of the most misunderstood forms of strength is silence. Many people believe that if you stop explaining yourself, you are weak, defensive, or hiding something. They assume that silence means you have nothing to say. But in reality, silence can be one of the most powerful expressions of self-respect. Because silence says something very clear, I will not participate in a conversation where my truth is constantly being dismissed. When you finally stop over explaining, something surprising begins to happen. The emotional chaos that once surrounded those conversations starts to fade. You no longer feel the pressure to defend every choice, every boundary, every feeling. And that creates space for something much healthier, clarity. You begin to notice who genuinely wants to understand you and who simply wants to challenge your reality. You see the difference between curiosity and criticism, between honest dialogue and subtle manipulation. Silence helps reveal those differences because when you stop feeding the cycle of endless explanation, people show you their true intentions. Some will step forward with respect and ask sincere questions. Those people value connection, but others will react with frustration or even anger. Why? Because they were comfortable with the version of you who kept defending yourself. They were comfortable with the version of you who felt the need to justify everything. And when that version of you disappears, the dynamic changes. Suddenly, they can no longer control the narrative. And that's when you realize something powerful. Silence is not about avoiding the truth. It's about refusing to argue with someone who has already decided they won't hear it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. The moment you stop explaining yourself to people who refuse to understand you, something subtle but powerful begins to change. The way others treat you starts to shift. At first, it might feel uncomfortable. For a long time, people may have been used to the version of you who always clarified, always justified, always tried to smooth everything over. They were familiar with the version of you who carried the emotional weight of every misunderstanding. But when self-respect enters your life, that pattern breaks. You begin to speak with fewer words, but stronger conviction. You stop rushing to defend yourself. You stop trying to win approval from people who have never offered you genuine respect. And something fascinating happens. People start to sense your boundaries. Not because you loudly announce them, but because your behavior quietly communicates them. When you no longer engage in endless explanations, you send a powerful message, my peace matters more than this argument. Some people will immediately recognize that shift and adjust their behavior. They will approach you with more care, more curiosity, and more respect. But others may react very differently. They might accuse you of being distant. They might say you've changed. They might even try harder to provoke you into defending yourself again. But this reaction tells you something important. It reveals who is benefiting from the old dynamic. Self-respect has a way of exposing relationships that were built on imbalance. When you stop over-explaining, you remove the emotional leverage that certain people relied on. And once that leverage disappears, the relationship either becomes healthier or it reveals its true nature. Either way, you gain something incredibly valuable. Clarity. And clarity is the foundation of every strong, self-respecting life. One of the hardest lessons in self-respect is learning to accept something that feels deeply uncomfortable at first. Sometimes you have to allow people to misunderstand you. For many people, this feels almost unbearable. We want to correct the story. We want to make sure people see our intentions clearly. We want our words, our actions, and our character to be represented fairly. So when someone walks away with the wrong impression of us, it can feel like a threat to who we are. But here is the truth most people eventually discover: you cannot control how others interpret you. You can speak honestly. You can act with integrity. You can explain yourself once with clarity. But after that, the way someone chooses to see you belongs to them. And trying to control that perception will drain your energy in ways you cannot imagine. Self-respect requires a certain kind of courage. The courage to live truthfully even when someone else insists on misunderstanding you. Because when you spend your life chasing other people's approval or trying to correct every false narrative, you lose something incredibly valuable. You lose your freedom. Freedom comes from knowing who you are without needing constant validation from others. It comes from trusting your intentions even when someone questions them. It comes from standing calmly in your truth instead of desperately trying to defend it. And here's the powerful part. The people who truly care about you will eventually see your consistency, your integrity, and your character. They don't need endless explanations. They simply observe how you live. Meanwhile, the people who are determined to misunderstand you would never have been satisfied anyway. So sometimes the strongest act of self-respect is this: you let them believe whatever they want, and you keep moving forward with your life. There is a quiet, almost magical peace that begins to grow when you finally stop trying to prove yourself to everyone. At first, it feels strange. You may feel guilty for not explaining, frustrated that others don't get it, or even anxious that people will judge you. That's normal. That's the mind adjusting to a new way of living, one where your worth no longer depends on their understanding. But then something extraordinary happens. Without the constant cycle of over-explaining, your energy no longer leaks out in endless defenses. You stop bending over backward to justify your choices, your feelings, your boundaries. You stop shrinking yourself to fit someone else's expectations. And with that space comes freedom. This is the freedom to be fully yourself without apology. It's the freedom to speak when you want to and stay silent when it protects your peace. It's the freedom to reserve your emotional labor for people who actually value it, instead of pouring it into the endless void of someone who refuses to understand. And the best part, this freedom is contagious. When you stop up explaining yourself, others begin to mirror your self-respect. They see that your voice matters. They see that your time matters. They see that you matter. You start attracting the people who actually deserve to witness your life, and the ones who don't slowly drift away. And in their absence, you realize something profound. Peace isn't found in convincing people. It's found in letting go of needing them to understand. You finally begin to feel what self-respect truly is: calm, unshakable, and deeply liberating. Here's the final unshakable truth: your life is not a performance for people who refuse to understand you. You do not owe anyone an explanation for your choices, your feelings, or your boundaries. Not your time, not your energy, not your dignity. When you stop bending, apologizing, clarifying, or justifying yourself, something powerful happens. You reclaim yourself. You reclaim your voice. You reclaim the energy that was being drained by endless cycles of misunderstanding. And in that reclamation, you discover a freedom that can't be taken from you. It's quiet, but it's fierce. It's still, but it commands respect. It's the freedom to live authentically without seeking permission. Some people will never understand you. Some will walk away angry or confused. That is their path, not yours. But the people who matter, the ones who see your worth without needing it explained, they will step into your life with clarity, care, and respect. So here's the lesson that transforms everything. Stop performing your life for the approval of others. Stop explaining yourself to those who refuse to hear you. Protect your energy, honor your truth, and move forward unapologetically. Self-respect is not something you negotiate. It's something you declare. It's a boundary. It's a revolution. And when you finally live this way, you will never feel small again, because the world doesn't define you. You define yourself. And that is the most powerful freedom of all.